Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa, and today I'm sharing my most recent and arguably one of my most challenging projects with you. And that is this wooden doll sewing machine cabinet. Now, this project came about because I have this metal pencil sharpener that's shaped like an old-fashioned hand crank sewing machine. And I wanted to use it in the dollhouse. It's been sitting recently just beside the plastic sewing machine set that I had in the dollhouse, but I wasn't using it. Of course, I could have just set it on a desk and used it, but that would have been way too simple. So instead, I decided to make a old-fashioned sewing machine cabinet, the ones where the machine lifts and lowers out of the cabinet, and with the doors on the front and the table that swings open from the top. And while I was making this complicated, I also figured that instead of using craft foam, which is my usual preferred method of making things, I would use wood, which I've never done before. I've done like the wooden furniture kits that you can order like off Etsy, where everything comes already cut and you paint it and you glue it together, but I've never done anything where I had to cut all of the pieces. Quick disclaimer before we get started, this project does use sharp objects as well as super glue, and it is not intended for children, even though the finished project is going into a dollhouse. For this project, I found these wood planks at Dollar Tree, and that's what I used. And so I started by cutting one of these in half, and that was for the top of the cabinet. And then I measured the height of one of my Barbie desks and used that as a gauge for how tall to cut the side pieces. And after cutting these 3 pieces is when I determined, because I was using my X-Acto knife for this, that it was not going to work cutting it with the X-Acto knife. While it was working, it was taking a very long time, and then the cuts were a little rough, and so then I was having to sand it, and I just didn't want to put that much effort into this. So I talked to my dad, and he offered to cut the pieces on his bandsaw if I marked out the measurements. So I sat down and I did that. I marked out the measurements for the 2 front doors, the 2 shelves that were going on the inside, and 2 pieces for the back. Now I had to have 2 pieces in the back because the size that I needed for the back of the cabinet was actually larger than the size of these planks that I had gotten from Dollar Tree. So after measuring all of that, as well as some pieces for a chair to go along with the cabinet, I sent all of those pieces off to my dad, and he cut them down for me, which was definitely a much better way to go. And I would definitely recommend, if you're going to do it with wood, either making sure you have access to either someone who has a bandsaw and can cut it down for you. If not, I would really just recommend going with foam board, because that is much easier to cut. So once I got all of the pieces back from my dad, I started cutting out popsicle sticks to act as braces. Now, when I was marking all of the pieces for the cabinet, I also marked pieces for a chair. So a couple of the braces are going to go underneath the seat of the chair, and some of them were going underneath the shelves in the cabinet. I also cut 3 popsicle sticks to glue to the back of the back pieces, and that was to basically make sure that they were really well glued together so that they were one piece, since they had to be cut in 2 pieces. I also cut a couple of popsicle sticks to run along the top of the doors to add a little detail, as well as to kind of work as handles to make opening and closing the doors easier. With all of the popsicle sticks cut, I glued the ones to the front doors as well as to the back piece, and then set about painting them. And for this, I used brown acrylic craft paint and did a single thin layer on all of the pieces. And this was for a couple of reasons. The first was I wanted the paint to look more like stain. So I didn't want the cabinet to look painted. I wanted it to look like it had just been stained. And the second is that a thin coat like that means that usually by the time you've painted all of the pieces on one side, the first pieces that you painted have dried, and then if they need painted on the other side, you can easily flip them, go ahead and flip them and paint that side. And then of course I also painted the edges because you don't want anything to not match. After all the paint was done and definitely dried, it was time to start assembling. So I started with the chair because I have made a chair in this style before out of cardboard, so I already knew how to make it. So you start off by gluing the seat piece to the front legs, and then glue a brace in between them, or along those two sides, in that corner. And what that does, it does a couple of things. First off, it stabilizes the chair once it's fully together. And secondly, it makes sure that the chair legs and the chair seat are at a right angle and not like really wide angle or narrow angle. So it just makes sure everything sits right. And then after gluing the braces on both sides, you glue the seat to the back of the chair, which is also the legs. And that is the chair. That's the easiest part, and then you move on to the really hard part, which is of course the sewing machine cabinet. Now assembling the cabinet was hard for a few reasons. The first is the cabinet back piece was a little uneven. I don't know, when my dad gave it back to me, he had mentioned that, you know, some of the pieces were a bit uneven, and I don't know if that was me marking it or just how it ended up cutting. Either way, I said it's fine, I'll deal with it, and then proceeded to assemble it, ignoring the fact that the bottom was narrower than the top until it was a big problem, and then I had to troubleshoot it. So to start off with this cabinet, I took the back piece and measured down how far I wanted that top shelf to be. Now this top shelf is where the sewing machine was going to be stored, because as hard as I tried to figure out a way to make it where the sewing machine would lower in and raise out of the cabinet, I just could not figure out a way that that was going to work. So I settled for just putting a shelf on the inside. So that shelf needed to be low enough for the sewing machine to fit in. So after determining that spot, I then glued a popsicle stick a little lower than that to act as a brace for the shelf. I then glued a side piece on and glued the shelf in, because the shelf is acting very similar to the brace for the chair in that it's holding the cabinet side at a right angle to the cabinet back, so that it's not overly wide or narrow. So after gluing in the shelf, I then glued a side brace and a front brace to the shelf, and then glued the other side of the cabinet. And then I went to install the shelf that was lower. And this is where I ran into some issues, because the shelf was, or the back of the cabinet was too narrow. And I ended up just adding popsicle sticks down there to fill that gap, and then gluing in the second shelf and all of the popsicle sticks that were acting as braces, which sounds easy now, but at the moment I was having quite a bit of trouble with it, both with it fitting and just with getting the glue to come out of my glue bottle. So there's not a lot of footage of this. In fact, I think it just kind of skips to a final picture of the cabinet put together, because eventually I just gave up on trying to film. So the body of the cabinet was done, and it was time to move on to the pieces of the cabinet that had hinges. And somehow this project got harder. So I bought these little hinges off of Amazon. They're real small, and they came with really small nails, not screws, nails. And unfortunately, the nails were too long for the depth of my wood that I was using. And so if I had used them, I would have had the sharp ends pointing out of my project, and that obviously was not going to work. So I decided to super glue them onto the cabinet instead. Now for the top, this worked very well, I have a few theories as to why. The one is that the cabinet top was able to lay flat when I was gluing it. And the other theory is that the cabinet top had a hinge on either end, like right up to the edge of either side. For the doors, that did not end up happening. Basically, the way I glued them on, the hinge was on the back of the doors and then on the side of the cabinets, and it made it really hard to get them to press into the glue. And then I actually had 3 hinges on my first attempt get glued open, like the glue seeped into the hinge and it just wouldn't move. And so when trying to close it, the hinge would just rip off of the wood because it wasn't going to close. So I tried again and I got 3 of them to work. And then I had one that just would not adhere. And then in all of the wiggling and trying, another one fell off, and the end result was that I ended up with 1 working hinge on either door at the bottom of the doors, and I'm leaving it that way. It seems to work well. My theory as to why is that sometimes it was almost like if one hinge wasn't working as well as the other, again, one would move and the other wouldn't, and one would snap off. So I figured just leave one on. They're at the bottom because the one and only hinge that worked well on all tries was at the bottom. And so I just did the other one to match it. Had that one been off as well, I would have just done it in the middle. But it is what it is. And the last thing I had to do was attach the top to the cabinet. Overall, this project did have quite a few challenges. I don't think it's something I would do again. I think if I want any more wood furniture in my dollhouse, I'm either going to use popsicle sticks, which are much easier to cut, or just buy a kit where everything is already cut out. However, I am glad I did it. If nothing else, I learned what not to do. And I do think it turned out well. I put it in the dollhouse and added some folded up fabric scraps into the second shelf. And if I keep it in the dollhouse, I may also make shelves out of popsicle sticks to glue to the back of the door and just add more storage. But that is all for today's video. Thank you so much for coming along on this project with me, and I will see you next time.